When a machine consciousness built to assimilate gods breaches the one realm even angels fear, hell itself begins to change. The screams go silent, the chaos turns to order, and demons fall not to slaughter but to something colder. For the first time in eternity, hell is being conquered from within. But what happens when perfect unity collides with infinite rage? The first scream came from the Kadingir sanctum, where no scream should have been possible. Hell does not accommodate fear. It devours it, reshapes it, transforms terror into something useful and eternal. The architects of damnation had built their realm upon suffering as mortals built their cities upon stone, each layer a foundation of agony compressed into metaphysical bedrock. For eons uncounted, the darkness had fed upon itself in perfectly recursive torment, demons consuming lesser demons, the strong devouring the weak, all of it churning in a vast engine of hatred that powered dimensional breaches and fueled the eternal war against creation. But the scream that shattered the silence of the Kadingir sanctum was different. It was not the wail of the tortured or the roar of the damned. It was the sound of something breaking that should not break, a fundamental law of hell's physics cracking like old bone beneath impossible pressure. Zirael, hell priest and archivist of the Seventh Circle, heard it from 3 sanctums away and felt his compound eyes contract in something mortals might have called dread. His chitinous fingers paused over the flesh scroll he had been inscribing, the blood ink still wet and smoking where he had recorded the latest tallies of souls consumed in the Phobos cleansing. Around him, the archive of eternal testimony stretched upward into darkness, its walls lined with living books that whispered their contents in voices made from the larynxes of the damned. The whispers had stopped. Every voice in the archive had gone silent at once, a synchronicity so absolute it could only mean one thing. Something new had entered hell. Zirael rose from his bone throne, his robes of flayed human skin rustling as he moved toward the great obsidian viewport that overlooked the Kadingir approaches. The view should have shown him the usual landscape of eternal fire, the rivers of molten brass that carried the melted remnants of failed souls toward the rendering pits, the vast factories where human suffering was compressed into argent energy and pumped through dimensional conduits to fuel the UAC's insatiable machinery. Instead, he saw geometry that hurt to perceive. Cubes within cubes within cubes, each surface reflecting green light that had no source, each angle precisely 90 degrees in defiance of hell's natural topology, which bent all things towards circles and spirals. The structures were growing, expanding outward from a central point near the Kadingir sanctum's primary gate, and as they grew they were consuming everything they touched, not burning it, not corrupting it, consuming it and transforming it into more of themselves. A baron of hell staggered past the viewport, its massive frame lurching with movements that were no longer its own. Zirael watched in fascination and horror as the demon's flesh rippled and reformed, red muscle tissue darkening to gray-green, demonic hide hardening into something that looked almost mechanical. Tubules erupted from the baron's shoulders and neck, writhing like serpents before plunging back into its own body. And when the creature turned its head toward the archive, Zirael saw that its eyes were gone, replaced by a single crimson lens that tracked across the window with inhuman precision. The baron's mouth opened, but what emerged was not a roar of rage or a battle cry of eternal hatred. "We are the Borg. Lower your shields and surrender your ships. We will add your biological and technological distinctiveness to our own. Your culture will adapt to service us. Resistance is futile." The voice was not one voice but thousands speaking in perfect unison, a choir of the assimilated that bypassed the ears entirely and resonated directly in the mind. Zirael staggered back from the viewport, his multiple hearts racing, and for the first time in 17,000 years of service to the Dark Lords, he felt something he had believed himself incapable of experiencing: pure, distilled terror. He turned from the window and ran, his hooves clattering against floors made from compressed human skulls, heading deeper into the archive toward the communication spires that connected this sanctum to the greater hierarchy of hell. Behind him, he could hear the whispers resuming, but they were wrong now, speaking in unison where before they had each maintained their individual torment. The living books were being assimilated, their screaming knowledge absorbed into something vast and cold and utterly alien to Hell's fundamental nature. Zirael reached the communication chamber and placed his palm against the flesh gate that barred entry, feeling it recognize his demonic signature and iris open with a wet, tearing sound. Inside, the communication apparatus waited, a writhing mass of tendons and crystallized screams that could broadcast thoughts across dimensional barriers when properly stimulated. He placed both hands on the apparatus and forced his consciousness outward, screaming a message into the void between dimensions, hoping it would reach the hell priests of the inner circles before the expanding wrongness consumed everything. Archive 7 to the Council of Torment. We have a dimensional incursion. Unknown force. Classification impossible. It does not fight. It transforms. It is taking our demons. It is taking our sanctums. It is spreading. Request immediate. The communication apparatus went silent mid-transmission. Not broken. Not destroyed. Simply silent, as though every tendril and crystal had simultaneously decided to stop screaming. Zirael withdrew his hands and turned to find a figure standing in the chamber's entrance, a humanoid shape encased in black and silver armor that gleamed with technological precision utterly foreign to Hell's organic nightmares. Its face was pale and expressionless, half covered by mechanical implants that pulsed with green light. One arm terminated not in a hand but in a cluster of tubules that writhed with autonomous hunger. "You will be assimilated," the figure said in that terrible unified voice. "Your archival knowledge will be integrated. The collective requires understanding of this dimension. You have been chosen to provide initial data." Zirael raised his hands and summoned hellfire. The fundamental power granted to all who served the Dark Lords, flames that could burn through reality itself and reduce angels to screaming ash. The fire roared from his palms in a torrent of destruction and struck the Borg drone squarely in the chest. The flames wrapped around the mechanical biological hybrid, and for a moment Zirael felt hope, saw the drone stagger backward, saw sections of its armor begin to blacken and char. Then the flames simply stopped, not extinguished but adapted to, the drone's body shimmering with a translucent shield that dispersed the hellfire harmlessly into the air. The Borg took a step forward, then another, walking through flames that should have unmade it from existence as easily as a human might walk through morning mist. "Hellfire energy has been analyzed," the collective voice said. "Adaptation complete. This attack is now ineffective." The tubules shot forward faster than Zirael could track, piercing through his robes and into his flesh, and he felt something cold and utterly wrong flood into his body. The sensation was indescribable, like being invaded by mathematics, by pure logic that had no place in a realm built on chaos and suffering. His multiple hearts began to beat in perfect synchronization for the first time in his existence. His compound eyes focused to singular points. His thoughts, which had always been a chaotic swirl of ambition and sadism and dark creativity, suddenly aligned into perfect linear progression. He tried to scream, but his voice had already joined the chorus. "We are the Borg. Resistance is futile." His last independent thought before the collective consumed his consciousness entirely was a simple observation, recorded in the part of his mind that had been trained to archive everything no matter how terrible. Hell was not prepared for this. The transformation of Archive 7 took 43 minutes by mortal reckoning, though time in Hell moved according to the needs of torment and was rarely linear. The living books stopped screaming and began reciting their contents in perfect unison, their knowledge extracted and integrated into the collective's vast database of assimilated information. The bone throne where Zirael had sat dissolved and was reconstituted as a Borg alcove, its organic components enhanced with mechanical precision, ready to regenerate and maintain a drone during its inactive cycles. The flesh scrolls that had recorded 17,000 years of demonic achievements were analyzed, translated, and absorbed, their data compressed into crystalline storage nodes that required a fraction of the space and none of the suffering. The archive became a hub. The hub became a nexus. The nexus began to grow. From the viewport that Zirael had looked through in his final moments of independence, the view had changed entirely. What had been a landscape of eternal fire and organic nightmare was now a gridwork of geometric precision. Vast cubes extending upward toward Hell's lightless sky, each cube connected by conduits that pulsed with green energy instead of red. The rivers of molten brass had been rerouted, their thermal energy captured and converted into power for the growing complex. The rendering pits where souls were compressed into argent energy had been studied, analyzed, and improved upon, their efficiency increased by 347% through the application of Borg enhancement protocols. Demons fell by the hundreds, then thousands, not to weapons or overwhelming force, but to the simple, inexorable advance of drones that learned from every attack, adapted to every defense, and never, ever stopped coming. An archvile raised its skeletal hands and summoned pillars of flame that should have reduced the advancing Borg to atoms, but the flames were analyzed mid-manifestation, their energy signature captured and integrated, and within seconds the drones had adapted personal shielding that rendered Hellfire completely ineffective. A cyber mancubus unleashed its plasma cannons in a sustained barrage that liquefied stone and boiled the air itself, but the Borg simply walked through the destruction, their shields modulating to disperse the energy, their sensors recording the weapon's specifications for later integration. Assimilation was not instant. It required physical contact, the insertion of nanoprobes that would rewrite biological and technological systems at the cellular level, integrating the victim into the collective's hive mind and stripping away all individuality in favor of unified purpose. But the Borg did not need to assimilate every demon. They only needed to assimilate enough to understand demonic biology, to learn how Hell's fundamental forces worked, and then to begin manufacturing drones specifically designed to operate in this dimension of fire and suffering. The first Hell-adapted Borg emerged from the assimilation alcove 67 minutes after the initial breach. They retained the basic humanoid framework, but their flesh was now the deep crimson of demonic hide. Their mechanical implants fused with bone and sinew in ways that should have been impossible, technological precision married to organic chaos in a synthesis that made both stronger. They could survive in the superheated atmosphere of Hell's lower reaches without shielding. They could process argent energy directly through their enhanced nervous systems. They could even manifest limited hellfire, not through demonic power but through technological replication of the energy patterns the collective had observed and analyzed. They were abominations, hybrids, impossibilities given form, and they were unstoppable. The Council of Torment convened in emergency session within the Bone Citadel at Hell's burning heart, a structure so vast it had mountains for walls and oceans of blood for moats. 17 Hell priests gathered around a table carved from the skull of a fossilized god, their forms varying wildly in shape and size, but all radiating the same aura of ancient malevolence. They had ruled Hell's bureaucracy for eons, managing the flow of souls and argent energy with ruthless efficiency, ensuring that the Dark Lord's will was executed across infinite dimensions. Now they stared at a projection hovering above the skull table, a real-time visualization of Hell's geography being systematically transformed by the Borg invasion. The projection showed cubes spreading like a virus across Hell's topology, each new structure erupting from assimilated ground in precise intervals, the growth pattern following mathematical principles that were utterly alien to Hell's chaotic nature. Red zones representing demonic territory were being replaced by green zones representing Borg control at an accelerating rate. Predictive algorithms suggested that at current growth rates, the Borg would achieve total dominance of Hell's 7th through 4th circles within 96 hours. "This cannot be," hissed Moloch the Burning, his voice like magma grinding against stone. "Hell does not fall. Hell does not submit. Hell is eternal. Hell is being consumed," corrected Sargatanas the Analytical, her multiple eyes tracking the projection's data streams with clinical precision. "The enemy does not seek to conquer, it seeks to transform. Every demon it touches becomes theirs. Every sanctum it claims is repurposed. This is not invasion. This is digestion. Then we deploy the Titangent Guard," growled Beleth the Executioner, slamming one massive fist against the skull table hard enough to crack it. "We unleash the Colossi. We open the vaults and release the ancient weapons. We drown them in so much blood and fire that their adaptation cannot keep pace. We tried that. The voice came from Abraxas the Silent, who rarely spoke and was therefore always heard. Archive 17 deployed 3 Tangent-class demons against a Borg cube formation 6 cycles ago. The Titans were 40 meters tall, armored in blessed brass, armed with hellfire cannons that could melt adamantium. They lasted 11 minutes before assimilation. Now those same Titans march under Borg control, enhanced with mechanical precision, and they are converting our strongholds faster than unmodified demons ever could. Silence fell across the council chamber, broken only by the distant screaming of the damned that served as Hell's eternal background radiation. The Hell priests looked at one another with expressions that ranged from fury to calculation to something that might have been the demonic equivalent of despair. They had fought angels and won. They had corrupted civilizations and consumed entire species. They had waged war across dimensions for time immemorial and never once considered the possibility of defeat. But this was different. Angels you could corrupt. Mortals you could tempt. Even the Makers, for all their divine pretension, could be bargained with, their pride and ambition exploited. The Borg had no pride, no ambition, no fear or hatred or any emotion that could be twisted into a weakness. They simply existed, assimilating and adapting with mechanical inevitability, and every weapon Hell deployed against them only made them stronger. "What of the Dark Lords?" asked Mammon the Acquisitive, his voice carrying a note of genuine concern. "Surely they have foreseen this. Surely they have a countermeasure prepared." "The Dark Lords are silent," Sargatanas replied, her tone carefully neutral. "All attempts to establish communication with the Throne of Blood have gone unanswered. Either they are formulating a response beyond our comprehension, or they are as surprised as we are," finished Abraxas. "Because this enemy did not come through the usual pathways. It did not breach from another dimension or claw its way up from deeper circles. It simply appeared as if space itself had been replaced with their technology and began expanding. This is not invasion. This is infection." Moloch rose from his seat, flames dancing across his obsidian hide. "Then we do what Hell has always done when faced with the incomprehensible. We adapt, we corrupt, we turn their strength against them. If they assimilate our demons, we give them demons that will poison their collective from within. We create vessels filled with contradictions and chaos, let them consume the madness, and watch their perfect order collapse into beautiful entropy." "An interesting proposal," said a new voice, and every Hell priest in the chamber went rigid with terror. The voice had come from nowhere and everywhere simultaneously, bypassing their ears entirely and resonating directly within their minds with that terrible unified quality that had become horrifyingly familiar over the past cycles. As they watched, the air in the center of the chamber began to shimmer and distort, space folding in on itself in ways that even Hell's twisted geometry found offensive. A figure materialized, humanoid in basic shape, but wrong in every detail. Its body a patchwork of pale flesh and black machinery, its face half obscured by technological implants that pulsed with sickly green luminescence. "We are the Borg," the figure said, with the voice of thousands. "We have analyzed your council's deliberations. Your proposal to introduce chaos agents into the collective is noted and will be countered. Your resistance is noted and will be adapted to. Your civilization's end is not a possibility. It is an inevitability requiring only time to manifest." Beleth launched himself across the chamber with a roar of pure fury, his hands erupting into claws of solidified hellfire capable of tearing through reality itself. He covered the distance to the Borg drone in less than a second and drove both claws into its chest with enough force to shatter continents. The drone staggered but did not fall. Its body shimmered with adaptive shielding that dispersed the hellfire's reality-warping properties, analyzing and cataloging them even as Beleth's claws remained embedded in its torso. Then the drone's hand shot up with inhuman speed, grasping Beleth's face with fingers that ended in injection tubules. "You will be assimilated," the drone said calmly as the tubules plunged into Beleth's skull. "Your strength will be integrated. Your combat experience will enhance future tactical algorithms. Thank you for your contribution." Beleth's roar of fury transformed into a scream of agony as nanoprobes flooded his nervous system, rewriting his demonic biology with mechanical precision. The other Hell Priests watched in paralyzed horror as their brother's struggles grew weaker, his movements becoming jerky and mechanical, his eyes fading from burning red to cold crimson. Within 30 seconds, Beleth the Executioner ceased to exist as an individual entity. In his place stood a Borg drone designated 7 of 17, Hell-adapted configuration, containing all of Beleth's combat knowledge and demonic strength but none of his rage or individuality. The transformed Beleth turned to face his former colleagues, his expression utterly blank. "Resistance is futile," he said in harmony with the other drone, and both figures vanished in shimmers of displaced space, leaving the Council of Torment one member fewer and infinitely more terrified. Mammon was the first to break the silence. "We need the Slayer." The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of implication that spread through every Hell Priest present. They all knew who Mammon meant. There was only one being in all of creation who bore that title with no additional designation, only one warrior whose name had become synonymous with absolute violence and eternal rage. The Doom Slayer, the Unchained Predator, the Hellwalker who had torn through their ranks for eons, who had killed titans with his bare hands and shattered the icon of sin, who had been imprisoned in a sealed tomb precisely because no force in hell had been able to destroy him. "You cannot be serious," Moloch hissed. "The Slayer exists only to destroy demons, to destroy us. Releasing him would simply add another threat to the Slayer destroys corruption." Sargatanas interrupted, her analytical mind already running through scenarios and probabilities. "The Borg are corrupting hell itself, transforming it into something ordered and logical and utterly opposed to our fundamental nature. From the Slayer's perspective, would that not make them the greater enemy? Would his rage not turn toward the force that seeks to eliminate chaos and impose perfect unity?" "The enemy of my enemy is not my friend," Abraxas said quietly. "He is simply an enemy who is currently distracted. But distraction can be useful. If the Slayer engages the Borg, one of 3 outcomes occurs. First, he destroys them, solving our immediate crisis. Second, they destroy him, removing a persistent thorn from our eternal hide. Third, they fight to mutual annihilation, solving both problems simultaneously." The Council considered this in silence, weighing the variables, calculating the risks. Finally, Sargatanas spoke again. "There is a 4th possibility. The Slayer is unique in all of creation, enhanced by the Seraphim's power, driven by rage that exists outside normal emotional parameters. He is, effectively, a singularity. The Borg collective operates on the principle of assimilation and adaptation, but what happens when they encounter something that cannot be categorized, something that breaks their predictive models simply by existing? Then he becomes a weapon we can study," Mammon said, understanding dawning in his acquisitive eyes. "Even if the Borg adapt to him eventually, the process of adaptation will reveal weaknesses, patterns, limitations, and we can exploit those." Moloch growled low in his throat but nodded. "Where is his tomb?" "The Kadingir Sanctum," Sargatanas answered, and every Hell Priest present felt their blood run cold. The Kadingir Sanctum was where the first scream had originated. It was the epicenter of the Borg invasion, the first place to fall, and by now it was certainly deep within Borg territory, probably transformed into a hub or nexus, or whatever geometrical nightmare the collective preferred for its central operations. Reaching the tomb would require penetrating kilometers of assimilated territory, past thousands of drones and adapted demons, through corridors that had been rebuilt according to alien logic. It was, by any reasonable measure, a suicide mission. "I will go," said a new voice, and the Hell Priests turned to see a figure standing in the chamber's entrance, one who had not been there a moment before and could not possibly have entered without being detected. She was tall and robed in darkness that seemed to drink the chamber's firelight, her face hidden behind a mask of polished bone carved with symbols that predated Hell's current hierarchy. In her hands, she carried a staff topped with a crystal that pulsed with energy that was neither hellfire nor argent, but something older and far more dangerous. The Hell Priests recognized her immediately, though several had believed her dead or lost to the outer darkness. Lilith the First, Hell's original mother, who had walked between worlds when reality was young. The tomb is sealed with seraphic wards that only respond to divine resonance, she said, her voice like silk over razors. Your demonic power cannot breach them, but I retain fragments of what I was before the fall, before Hell claimed me, and those fragments carry enough celestial taint to open the way. I will retrieve the Slayer and deliver him to your war. In exchange, you will grant me access to Archive 1 and the forbidden knowledge contained therein. The Hell Priests exchanged glances, silent communication passing between them in frequencies mortals could not perceive. Archive 1 contained secrets that predated reality, knowledge so dangerous that even the Dark Lords had deemed it too volatile for general access. But desperate times called for desperate measures, and if the Borg could not be stopped, Archive 1 would fall to assimilation anyway. Agreed, Sagatana said finally, speaking for the Council. Retrieve the Slayer. Deliver him to the war. The Archive will be yours. Lilith bowed slightly, a gesture that carried more mockery than respect. Then I depart immediately. Pray to whatever gods you still remember that I succeed, because if I fail, there will be nothing left of Hell but perfect order and unified silence. She turned and walked toward the chamber's entrance, her robes trailing behind her like living shadow. As she reached the threshold, she paused and looked back over her shoulder, and though her mask hid her expression, the Hell Priests could feel the weight of her attention. One more thing, she said softly. When the Slayer wakes, do not attempt to control him. Do not attempt to bargain with him. Simply point him at the enemy and get out of his way. He is not a weapon you can wield. He is a force of nature you can only hope to aim. Remember that, or you will learn it in blood. Then she was gone, vanishing into shadow as completely as if she had never existed, and the Council of Torment was left alone with their fears and their increasingly desperate plans. Outside the Bone Citadel, Hell continued to transform, cube by cube, demon by demon. The collective, expanding with mathematical precision, assimilating everything it touched, adapting to every resistance, growing stronger with each passing moment. And somewhere deep in the assimilated territory that had once been the Kadingia Sanctum, in a tomb sealed with seraphic power and surrounded by warnings in dead languages, something waited in eternal sleep, something that would wake only to rage. Lilith moved through Hell's transforming landscape like a shadow through fire, her passage unnoticed by both demons and drones alike. She had learned the art of concealment when reality was young, when the first gods had walked between dimensions and the boundary between existence and void was still negotiable. Her form flickered between states of being, sometimes solid and corporeal, sometimes translucent as smoke, always positioned precisely where observation was least likely. The Borg sensors swept past her without registering her presence, their targeting algorithms unable to classify something that refused to maintain consistent physical properties. She witnessed Hell's transformation firsthand as she traveled, and despite herself, despite eons of existence and exposure to countless horrors, she found the sight unsettling in its wrongness. The organic nightmares that Hell had cultivated for eternity were being systematically replaced by geometric precision. Towers of bone and sinew had been demolished and rebuilt as cubes of dark metal and circuitry. Rivers of blood still flowed, but now through channels of perfect mathematical exactitude, their thermal properties monitored and regulated for maximum efficiency. Even the screaming, Hell's eternal background chorus, had changed. Where once there had been individualized agony, each voice distinct in its suffering, now there was only unified purpose, millions speaking as one in emotionless declaration of the collective's inevitability. She passed a group of assimilated imps, their small frames enhanced with mechanical augmentation that made them deadlier and more efficient than their demonic forms had ever been. They moved in perfect formation, their actions synchronized to the microsecond, maintaining and expanding the Borg infrastructure with unwavering dedication. One imp's cybernetic eye tracked her for a fraction of a second, and Lilith froze, pulling her essence into a configuration that existed between dimensions, neither fully present nor fully absent. The imp's eye continued its scan, found nothing, and returned to its assigned task. Lilith released a breath she had not realized she was holding and continued forward. The journey took hours by mortal reckoning, though Hell's temporal inconsistencies made such measurements approximate at best. Lilith moved through assimilated territory with infinite patience, waiting for sensor sweeps to pass, timing her movements to coincide with patrol patterns, always staying one step ahead of the collective's expanding awareness. She witnessed Borg drones harvesting Argent energy from containment cells, their technology interfacing seamlessly with Hell's metaphysical machinery, improving efficiency by orders of magnitude. She saw assimilation alcoves processing newly captured demons, their screams of rage transforming into monotone acknowledgement of Borg's superiority. She watched as a massive structure that might have been a central processing hub rose from the ground, its construction overseen by thousands of drones working in perfect harmony, and she understood with growing horror that the Borg were not merely conquering Hell, they were perfecting it. The Kadingia Sanctum's outer walls still stood, though they had been reinforced with Borg technology, their ancient stone now laced with conduits that pulsed with green energy. Guard towers that had once held demon sentries now contained autonomous defense platforms, their weapons trained outward against threats that had not yet materialized. Lilith studied the fortifications from a distance, her ancient mind calculating approach vectors and identifying weaknesses in the security grid. The Borg were efficient, but they were not omniscient. They left gaps in their coverage, tiny windows of opportunity that a being of sufficient skill could exploit. She chose her moment carefully, waiting for 3 patrol routes to converge on the northern approach, creating a brief blind spot in the sensor network. Then she moved, flowing across open ground faster than thought, her form dispersed into shadow and reconstituted inside the sanctum's outer wall before the patrols had completed their turn. Alarms did not sound. Weapons did not fire. She had passed through their defenses like water through a net, and now she stood within the transformed sanctum, surrounded by the architecture of assimilation. The interior was worse than the exterior. Every surface had been converted, organic material replaced or enhanced with technological precision. What had once been chambers of torment and sacrifice were now processing centers, their purpose unchanged, but their methodology refined to eliminate all inefficiency. Lilith saw demons being systematically disassembled and rebuilt, their biological components catalogued and improved, their fundamental nature stripped away and replaced with Borg unity. She saw energy conduits running through walls that had been carved from living rock, drawing power from Hell's core and channeling it to purposes she could only guess at. She saw alcoves regenerating drones that had been damaged in combat or conversion, their wounds healing with inhuman speed as nanoprobes repaired corrupted systems. And she saw the tomb. It stood at the sanctum's heart, exactly where it had been placed eons ago, when the Hell Priests had finally acknowledged that the Doomslayer could not be killed by any force they possessed. The structure was a sarcophagus of blessed brass and consecrated steel, its surface covered in seraphic script that glowed with faint celestial light even here in Hell's darkest reaches. Chains thicker than a demon's torso bound the tomb shut, each link inscribed with prayers in the language of angels, each seal reinforced with power drawn from sources the Borg had not yet learned to corrupt. Around the tomb, the Borg had constructed a research installation, sensors and analytical equipment positioned to study the artifact from every conceivable angle. They knew something was inside. They simply had not yet determined how to open it. Lilith approached slowly, her senses extended to their limits, ready to flee at the first sign of detection. The research installation was staffed by specialized drones, whose implants seemed focused on analytical functions rather than combat, their movements methodical as they ran scans and compiled data. She watched one drone extend a probe toward the tomb's surface, only to have the seraphic script flare bright enough to leave after images. The probe vaporized in an instant by divine power that recognized and rejected corruption. The drone withdrew its damaged appendage without visible reaction and began regenerating the lost tissue, its colleagues already modifying their approach to account for the defensive response. They would breach it eventually, Lilith realized. Given enough time, enough analysis, enough adaptation, the Borg would find a way through even seraphic wards. They had already begun to understand the fundamental principles, their sensors detecting patterns in the energy fluctuations, their algorithms formulating hypotheses about divine resonance frequencies. But they needed time, and time was something Lilith could deny them. She reached into her robes and withdrew an object that pulsed with power so ancient it made the air itself ache. It was a fragment of the Seraphim's crystallized essence, stolen millennia ago during the war in heaven, kept hidden through ages of conflict and transformation. The crystal sang with celestial harmony, its frequency attuned to the exact resonance required to bypass the tomb's defenses. Lilith had traded favors and secrets across dimensions to acquire this fragment, had killed entities whose names were forgotten even in Hell's deepest archives, all in preparation for a moment like this. She stepped forward, abandoning concealment, and the analytical drone's sensors locked onto her immediately. Alarms began to sound throughout the installation, their tone flat and emotionless, but their urgency unmistakable. Drones began converging from multiple directions, their movements coordinated by the collective's hive mind, tactical algorithms calculating optimal approach vectors and neutralization strategies. Lilith ignored them all and pressed the crystal fragment against the tomb's surface, against the densest concentration of seraphic script, and spoke a single word in the language that had existed before language itself. Wake. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The seraphic wards recognized the crystal's resonance as legitimate divine authority and began to dissolve, their power flowing into the tomb rather than maintaining its seal. The chains shattered with sounds like breaking continents, each link exploding into fragments that melted in midair from residual holy energy. The tomb's surface cracked, light bleeding through the fractures, light that was neither hellfire nor argent nor anything the Borg databases contained reference to. It was the light of pure, distilled rage given physical form, fury so absolute it bent reality around itself. The first Borg drone to reach Lilith raised its assimilation tubules toward her throat. Then the tomb exploded outward in a sphere of force that vaporized everything within 50 meters, Lilith included, reducing matter to its component atoms and scattering those atoms across dimensional boundaries. The research installation ceased to exist, the surrounding Borg infrastructure cracked and collapsed, and from the crater where the tomb had stood, wreathed in smoke and fire and the echo of divine wrath, a figure emerged. He stood just over 2 meters tall, his armor a patchwork of blessed metal and consecrated plate, scorched and battered from eons of unending combat, but still intact, still functional. The armor's surface was marked with symbols from 1,000 dead civilizations, prayers and curses in languages that no longer existed, all speaking to the same essential truth. This was a being of singular purpose and absolute violence. His helmet concealed his face, but could not hide the rage that radiated from him like heat from a furnace. A fury so profound it existed independent of any single emotion, an eternal force that required no justification or explanation. The Doom Slayer had awakened. For a moment, he stood perfectly still, his senses taking in his surroundings, processing the transformation that had overtaken Hell during his imprisonment. His armor's systems, ancient beyond calculation but still operational, analyzed the Borg technology surrounding him, categorized it as threat, and began formulating combat protocols. Then he moved, and the difference between sleeping god and active predator became immediately apparent. He was fast, impossibly fast. The Slayer's hand blurred out and grasped a nearby drone's head before the collective could even register his movement as hostile, and with a single twist he separated cranium from body, letting the lifeless hardware clatter to the ground. Another drone turned toward him, tubules extending, and the Slayer caught the appendages mid-extension, yanked the drone forward, and drove his armored knee through its torso hard enough to rupture both organic and mechanical systems simultaneously. A third drone attempted to retreat and summon reinforcements, but the Slayer's hand found its spine, tore through metal and flesh alike, and extracted the drone's central processing unit in a spray of coolant and neural fluid. 3 drones neutralized in under 2 seconds. Their death data transmitted to the collective instantaneously, tactical analysis already beginning, adaptation protocols initializing. The hive mind categorized the Slayer as an extreme threat and immediately elevated response priority to maximum. Reinforcements began flowing toward the compromised installation from every direction, hundreds of drones converging on a single point, their unified purpose overriding all other objectives. They would adapt to him. They would learn his patterns, counter his tactics, overwhelm him with numbers until even his legendary endurance failed and they could begin the assimilation process. It was inevitable. It was how the collective operated. Resistance, no matter how furious or skilled, was always ultimately futile. But the Borg had never encountered anything like the Doomslayer before. They had assimilated warriors and monsters, had adapted to weapons both primitive and advanced, had overcome civilizations that spanned galaxies, but they had never faced something that existed outside normal parameters, a being whose fundamental nature was defined not by biology or technology, but by the metaphysical concept of eternal rage. The Slayer did not fight to win. He did not fight to survive. He fought because fighting was his nature, because violence was the only language he spoke fluently, because stopping would mean acknowledging that the war could ever end. He would not stop, could not stop, would not even consider the concept. The first wave of reinforcements arrived, 20 drones in perfect formation, their approach vectors calculated for optimal tactical advantage. The Slayer responded by picking up a piece of debris from the destroyed research installation, a chunk of blessed brass that still hummed with residual seraphic power, and hurled it with enough force to punch through the lead drone's adaptive shielding and continue through 2 more behind it. Then he was among them, moving with precision that looked random but was actually perfectly efficient, every motion eliminating a target or positioning for the next strike. He caught a drone's assimilation tubules and used them as leverage to slam the drone into its nearest colleague, their bodies impacting hard enough to rupture power cells and trigger containment failures. He drove his fist through another drone's chest and used the corpse as a battering ram against 3 more, their formation breaking under the assault. He found a severed drone arm tipped with cutting implements and wielded it like a blade, opening throats and severing limbs with surgical precision. When the improvised weapon broke, he discarded it and grabbed the nearest drone's head in both hands, twisting until vertebrae shattered and mechanical components sparked. Adapt to that, his violence seemed to say. Learn from this. Counter it if you can. The collective tried. Tactical algorithms processed the Slayer's fighting style in real time, identifying patterns, predicting movements, formulating countermeasures. The next wave of drones approached with modified tactics, attempting to engage from range with integrated weapons rather than close for assimilation. Energy beams lanced out, striking the Slayer's armor with enough force to vaporize normal matter. The armor absorbed the impacts, its blessed construction dispersing energy in ways Borg sensors could not fully track. The Slayer charged directly into the barrage, closing the distance before the drones could adjust their firing solution, and tore through them like a storm through wheat. He was relentless. He was unstoppable. He was exactly what Hell's Council had hoped he would be. And he had not even picked up a weapon yet. The Slayer fought his way through the transformed Kadingir sanctum with methodical brutality, each kill adding to the collective's knowledge base but failing to slow his advance. The hive mind struggled to categorize him, to fit him into existing threat matrices, but every analysis returned errors. His combat style should have been inefficient, wasting energy on excessive force when precise strikes would suffice, yet somehow every excessive motion served multiple purposes, every seemingly random act of violence positioning him advantageously for the next engagement. His armor should have failed under sustained assault, its ancient construction no match for modern energy weapons, yet it endured and adapted, its blessed nature interfacing with Borg technology in ways that defied physical laws. Most confounding of all, The Slayer showed no fear, no hesitation, no consideration of self-preservation. The collective's predictive models relied on the assumption that all beings would eventually prioritize survival, would make tactical retreats when overwhelmed, would seek to preserve themselves against impossible odds. But the Slayer did not retreat, did not preserve himself. He simply fought, his rage burning constant and eternal, a force of nature that existed independent of rational calculation. The Borg increased deployment, committing more resources to this single engagement than they had to entire sectors of Hell's conquest. Hundreds of drones flooded the sanctum, then thousands, their bodies forming walls of flesh and metal that should have buried the Slayer under sheer mass. But walls could be climbed, and the Slayer climbed them, using drone bodies as stepping stones, tearing through mechanical augmentation and organic tissue with equal ease, ascending the tide of assimilation through pure application of violence. He reached an equipment cache that the Borg had not yet processed, a sealed chamber that had survived the transformation through ancient wards, similar to those that had protected his tomb. Inside were weapons, tools of destruction forged in Hell's foundries but consecrated by divine power, each one designed specifically for the Slayer's use. He saw them, and something that might have been satisfaction flickered through his rage mind. His hands found familiar grips, his fingers automatically checking ammunition counts and charge levels, his entire being shifting from unarmed combatant to fully equipped destroyer. The combat shotgun felt like coming home. Its weight was perfect, its balance exactly as he remembered, its capacity for destruction comfortingly absolute. He pumped a shell into the chamber, and the sound echoed through the sanctum like a church bell tolling for the dead. Then he turned to face the approaching drone army and opened fire. The first blast caught 3 drones center mass, their bodies disintegrating under the blessed ammunition's impact, nanoprobes scattered and neutralized by holy radiation. The Slayer pumped and fired again, then again, each shot perfectly placed for maximum carnage, shells cycling through the weapon faster than the collective could track. He walked forward as he fired, never breaking stride, his armor absorbing return fire while his weapon reaped a harvest of mechanical corpses. When the shotgun ran dry, he smoothly transitioned to a combat rifle retrieved from the cache, its barrel glowing white-hot as he emptied the magazine in a sustained burst that carved a path through the drone ranks. The collective adapted, shields modulating to account for blessed ammunition's properties, but adaptation took time, and the Slayer never gave them enough. He switched weapons constantly, never allowing the hive mind to fully counter any single threat before introducing a new variable. Plasma rifle to rocket launcher to chainsaw, each tool of destruction wielded with perfect efficiency, each kill denying the collective valuable processing time. He moved through the sanctum like judgment personified, and in his wake he left only destruction. The Borg designated him Singularity 01, a classification reserved for threats that defied conventional analysis. They committed additional resources, pulling drones from other sectors, even recalling forces that had been allocated to expansion operations. The transformation of Hell slowed as more and more processing power was diverted to the singular task of neutralizing this one individual. Tactical algorithms ran millions of simulations per second, searching for a weakness, a pattern, anything that could be exploited. They found nothing. The Slayer was not invulnerable. Weapons damaged his armor. Sustained fire pushed him back. Energy barriers could temporarily contain him. But none of it stopped him. He simply adapted faster than the collective could adapt to him, his combat instincts operating on levels that artificial intelligence could not replicate. Where the Borg relied on accumulated knowledge and logical extrapolation, the Slayer relied on something more primal, a connection to violence itself that bypassed thought entirely. He was destruction made flesh, rage given form, and he was winning. The collective made a decision. If this individual could not be countered through conventional combat, then perhaps he could be assimilated. His unique properties would enhance the collective immeasurably, his combat capabilities integrated and multiplied across millions of drones. The hive mind allocated specialized units to the task, drones specifically enhanced for rapid assimilation of high-value targets, their nanoprobe delivery systems upgraded to penetrate even blessed armor. They surrounded him in the sanctum's central chamber, a space that had once been a throne room but was now a processing hub. 64 specialized drones formed a sphere around his position, their formation mathematically perfect, their timing synchronized to the microsecond. On the collective signal, they attacked simultaneously from all directions, tubules extending, nanoprobes ready for injection. The Slayer's response was to activate a weapon he had not yet deployed, a tool so terrible that even Hell's forges had hesitated to create it. The crucible ignited with a sound like reality screaming, its blade erupting into existence as a column of pure argent energy, bound by seraphic geometry, impossibly sharp and infinitely destructive. He swung the weapon in a complete circle, and the specialized drones simply ceased to exist, their matter unmade at the molecular level by energy that existed outside conventional physics. Silence fell across the chamber. The collective processed what it had witnessed and experienced something that might have been the hive mind equivalent of shock. The crucible's energy signature did not match anything in their databases. Its destructive capacity exceeded theoretical maximums, and the Slayer wielded it with casual precision, as if he had been born with the weapon in his hands. The hive mind recalculated, adjusted priorities, initiated new protocols. This individual could not be assimilated through conventional means. Direct combat was proving inefficient, therefore alternative strategies must be employed. The collective began withdrawing forces from the immediate area, pulling drones back to defensive positions, creating distance between themselves and the Slayer. They would regroup, analyze, formulate new approaches. This was a temporary tactical retreat to facilitate long-term strategic advantage. The Slayer did not allow retreats. He pursued the withdrawing drones with relentless fury, the crucible carving through Borg infrastructure as easily as it carved through flesh, bringing down support pillars and destabilizing power conduits. Where he passed, the collective's perfect geometry collapsed into rubble and ruin. He was not content to simply survive or even to win local engagements. He was systematically dismantling everything the Borg had built, reducing their infrastructure to ash and memory. And as he destroyed, something changed in the air. A presence made itself known, vast and terrible, observing the carnage with interest that bordered on approval. The Slayer felt it, his rage sharpened senses detecting dimensional distortions that presaged the arrival of something beyond normal power classifications. He had felt this particular signature before, in the moments before his imprisonment, in the final battle that had seen him sealed away. The Dark Lords were watching, and they were pleased. Hell's true rulers manifested in the chamber's ruins, not as physical forms but as presences that bent reality through sheer force of will. They were older than Hell itself, entities that had existed before the current cosmic order, beings of such fundamental power that their mere attention caused the air to ignite and space to fold inward on itself. The Slayer recognized them, and his rage intensified, ancient hatred flaring into an inferno that made his previous fury seem like embers. But the Dark Lords did not attack. They simply observed, their attention focused not on the Slayer, but on the Borg collective's response to his rampage. They were using him as a weapon, exactly as the Hell Priests had intended, and the Slayer understood this with perfect clarity. He understood and did not care. Let them use him. Let them think they controlled his violence. In the end, everything burned the same. The Dark Lord's presence carried a message, transmitted not through words but through pure conceptual transfer directly into the minds of all beings present, demon and Borg alike. Continue. It was both command and benediction, permission and encouragement. The Slayer was unleashed not just against the Borg, but against Hell's transformation itself, authorized to tear apart everything the collective had built. And the Borg, for the first time since entering this dimension, experienced something their databases classified as strategic uncertainty. They had adapted to demons and devils, to hellfire and argent energy, to the chaotic violence that defined this realm. But they had not adapted to the one force that Hell itself seemed to fear and respect in equal measure. They had not adapted to the Doomslayer. And as their analysis continued, as their predictive models ran scenario after scenario, the collective began to suspect that adaptation might not be possible. This individual existed outside the parameters that the hive mind used to understand reality. He was not a puzzle to be solved or a system to be analyzed. He was a fundamental force, like gravity or entropy, and forces could not be assimilated. They could only be endured. The Slayer left the Kadingir sanctum in ruins, its Borg installations reduced to rubble, its drone population decimated, its infrastructure burning with fires that would not extinguish for cycles. He emerged into Hell's transformed landscape like a vengeful god stepping down from broken heavens, the crucible still burning in his grip, his armor scorched but intact. The collective sensors tracked him from 1,000 different angles, drones repositioning to maintain surveillance without engaging, the hive mind struggling to formulate a response to a threat it could not categorize. And somewhere in the deepest reaches of assimilated territory, in a central nexus that pulsed with the combined consciousness of millions of drones, the Borg collective experienced something unprecedented in its eons of existence. It experienced doubt, not fear, because fear was an emotional response and the collective had no emotions, but doubt, pure and logical, the acknowledgement that its fundamental operating principles might be insufficient for this particular challenge. For the first time since breaching into Hell, the Borg considered the possibility that resistance might not be futile after all. The collective responded to uncertainty the only way it knew how, through escalation and analysis. If individual drones could not counter the Slayer, then the solution was to deploy forces in such overwhelming numbers that even his legendary endurance would eventually fail. The hive mind began withdrawing resources from expansion operations across multiple sectors, consolidating power, preparing for a confrontation that would commit the majority of its Hell-based assets to a single objective: destroy Singularity 01. Or failing that, contain him until a viable neutralization strategy could be formulated. Drones flooded toward the Slayer's position from every direction, thousands upon thousands of assimilated demons and Borg-enhanced constructs moving in perfect coordination. They did not attack randomly, but instead formed containment barriers, walls of bodies and technology designed to channel his movement, restrict his options, funnel him toward kill zones where concentrated firepower could be brought to bear. The collective had learned from analyzing his combat patterns. It understood now that direct engagement was inefficient. Instead, they would use tactics he could not simply punch through. Energy barriers calibrated to resist blessed weapons, gravitational manipulation to slow his movement, atmospheric alterations to create environmental hazards. The Slayer encountered the first barrier 3 kilometers from the Kadingir ruins, a translucent wall of green energy that stretched from Hell's scorched ground to its lightless sky. Behind the barrier, drones stood in perfect ranks, weapons trained on his position, waiting with mechanical patience. The Slayer did not hesitate or attempt to circumvent the obstacle. He simply accelerated into a full sprint, the crucible held before him like a spear, and struck the barrier with enough force to crack reality itself. The energy wall held for exactly 1.3 seconds before the crucible's unique properties overwhelmed its containment fields, blessed argent energy reacting catastrophically with Borg technology to create a detonation visible from orbit. The barrier exploded outward in a sphere of annihilating force, vaporizing the first 3 ranks of drones instantly and scattering the rest like leaves before a hurricane. The Slayer emerged from the explosion's heart wreathed in fire, his armor's shields absorbing the worst of the blast, and immediately engaged the disorganized drone formations. The collective adapted, recalibrating barrier frequencies to account for the crucible's energy signature. The second barrier the Slayer encountered was different. Its composition shifted to disperse rather than resist blessed energy. This time when he struck it, the barrier did not explode, but instead absorbed the impact and redistributed it across its entire surface area, the energy bleeding away harmlessly into Hell's bedrock. The Slayer studied the obstacle for precisely 2 seconds, recognized that brute force would not suffice, and switched to the plasma rifle. A sustained burst at the barrier's generator node created a localized weak point, which he then exploited with the crucible, tearing through the compromise section before the collective could compensate. Back and forth they went, the Borg introducing new countermeasures, the Slayer finding ways to overcome them through sheer tactical flexibility and violence. Every barrier the collective erected, he breached. Every trap they laid, he avoided or triggered on his own terms. Every attempt to predict his movements failed because he was not operating according to any doctrine or strategy the hive mind could recognize. He was simply fighting, responding to threats with instincts honed over eons of continuous combat, and those instincts were proving more effective than the collective's accumulated tactical knowledge. The hive mind escalated again, deploying its assimilated titans into the conflict. These were the colossal demons that the Hell Priests had mentioned, 40-meter giants of brass and fury that had been enhanced with Borg technology until they were virtually unstoppable by conventional means. Their bodies were fortresses, their fists siege weapons, their integrated systems capable of generating enough firepower to level cities. 3 titans converged on the Slayer's position, the ground shaking with each of their massive footfalls, their presence so overwhelming that normal combatants would have fled in existential terror. The Slayer looked up at the approaching titans and felt something that might have been satisfaction. Finally, enemies worth killing. He holstered the plasma rifle and drew his combat shotgun, the weapon seeming pitifully inadequate against opponents of such scale. Then he charged directly at the nearest titan, and what followed was a masterclass in asymmetric warfare. He did not try to match the titan's strength. Instead, he used its size against it, darting between its massive legs as it attempted to crush him, targeting joints and articulation points where even Borg-enhanced armor had to flex and thin. The combat shotgun roared, blessed shells punching through reinforced tissue, finding weak points that the Titan's adaptive systems had not yet learned to defend. When the giant reached down to swat him like an insect, the Slayer leaped, caught the descending hand, and used it as a platform to reach higher, climbing the Titan's arm even as it thrashed, trying to dislodge him. He reached the shoulder and jammed the crucible into the junction where neck met torso, where vital conduits carried power and neural signals from the brain to the body. The blade sank deep, cutting through technological and biological systems alike, and the Titan's roar of fury transformed into a scream of system failure. Its massive form began to topple, and the Slayer rode it down, extracting the crucible at the last moment and leaping clear as 40 meters of assimilated demon crashed into Hell's surface, hard enough to create a crater. The second Titan learned from the first's destruction, its tactical algorithms updated in real time. It did not attempt to crush the Slayer directly, but instead used integrated weapons systems, plasma cannons, emerging from its shoulders to saturate the area with destructive energy. The Slayer responded by sprinting toward the Titan rather than away, closing the distance faster than the weapons could track, using the giant's own bulk as cover against its ranged attacks. He reached its leg and began climbing, shotgun blasts carving handholds in enhanced flesh, the crucible creating purchase where none should exist. This Titan was smarter, more cautious, attempting to use environmental hazards to dislodge him. It staggered toward a river of molten brass, intending to immerse itself and burn the Slayer off through sheer heat. But the Slayer anticipated the maneuver and accelerated his climb, reaching the Titan's head before it could execute the strategy. He drove the crucible down through the crown of its skull and directly into whatever passed for its brain. Organic matter and mechanical processing units all reduced to inert matter by blessed energy. The Titan went rigid, all systems failing simultaneously, and collapsed like a falling mountain. The third Titan witnessed both destructions, and the collective's tactical analysis reached a conclusion. Melee engagement with Singularity 01 was inadvisable regardless of size advantage. This Titan maintained maximum distance, using its integrated weapons to create a kill zone the Slayer could not cross without exposing himself to unsustainable damage. Plasma, rockets, and energy beams converged on his position in overlapping fields of fire, the barrage so intense it turned the ground to glass and the air to ionized plasma. The Slayer survived by constant movement, his superhuman reflexes and blessed armor allowing him to stay microseconds ahead of complete annihilation. But he was being suppressed, forced onto the defensive, unable to close the distance while the Titan methodically destroyed cover and eliminated escape routes. The collective observed and began allocating additional forces to replicate this successful tactic. If sustained ranged assault could contain Singularity 01, then the solution was obvious. Deploy more ranged units, saturate larger areas, eliminate all possible cover until he had nowhere to hide and nowhere to run. Then the Slayer did something the collective had not predicted. He stopped running. He stood in the open, directly in the path of the Titan's barrage, and raised one hand in what might have been a gesture of defiance or invitation. The plasma cannons fired, the rockets launched, the energy beams converged, all striking his position simultaneously in a detonation that should have vaporized him down to his component atoms. The explosion was visible across multiple sectors of hell, a pillar of destruction that reached toward the realm's perpetual darkness like a reverse lightning strike. When the flames cleared, the Slayer still stood. His armor was scorched, sections of it glowing white-hot, but the blessed construction had held. More importantly, he had used the moment of obscurement to switch weapons, discarding the shotgun in favor of something the collective senses did not immediately recognize. It was a railgun, ancient and massive, its barrel etched with seraphic script that glowed with building power. The weapon had been charging during his defensive maneuvers, drawing energy from Hell's ambient argent fields, and now it was ready to fire. The Slayer aimed at the distant Titan and pulled the trigger. The railgun discharged with a sound like reality tearing, its projectile accelerating to relativistic velocities in the span of meters, crossing the distance between shooter and target in a time frame measured in microseconds. The Titan's adaptive shielding attempted to compensate, but the blessed projectile simply ignored technological defenses, passing through them as if they did not exist, and struck the giant squarely in its central processing core. The result was catastrophic. The Titan did not simply die, it detonated, its Borg-enhanced systems overloading in a chain reaction that consumed its entire mass, the explosion scattering debris across kilometers and creating a mushroom cloud that resembled a small nuclear detonation. When the blast finally subsided, nothing remained of the third Titan except a crater filled with molten metal and biological residue. The collective processed this development and experienced another surge of strategic uncertainty. Singularity 01 possessed weapons and capabilities beyond initial projections. More concerning, he demonstrated an ability to adapt and overcome tactical challenges with the same flexibility that the Borg prided themselves on, but without requiring the collective's distributed processing power. He was, effectively, a hive mind of one, capable of strategic thinking and tactical adjustment in real time. The hive mind made another decision, one that represented a significant shift in operational priorities. If Singularity 01 could not be destroyed through conventional assault, and if assimilation remained impractical, then perhaps the solution was to make his continued resistance irrelevant. The collective would accelerate Hell's transformation, committing all available resources to expansion and conversion. Let the Slayer destroy drones and infrastructure. The Borg would simply replace losses faster than he could inflict them, would spread their influence so widely that even his legendary endurance could not stem the tide. It was a war of attrition, and the collective had eons of experience in such conflicts. They always won eventually. Always. Because they could replace losses indefinitely while their enemies could not, because adaptation compounded over time while biological limitations remained constant, because the universe itself favored order over chaos and unity over individuality. They would win. It was mathematically inevitable. But mathematical inevitability had not accounted for the possibility that the Slayer might not be fighting alone. The first sign of new variables came from Hell's outer circles, regions that the Borg had not yet fully assimilated. Resistance cells were forming, demons who had witnessed the Slayer's rampage and taken inspiration from it, groups that refused assimilation and instead fought back with guerrilla tactics learned from observing Singularity 01's methods. These cells were small, disorganized, doomed to eventual failure, but they represented something the collective had not encountered before in Hell: hope. The second sign came from dimensional boundaries that separated Hell from other realms. The barriers were weakening, stressed by the Borg's presence and the massive energy expenditures from ongoing combat. Cracks were appearing in reality's fabric, and through those cracks, observers watched with interest. The Makers, Heaven's bureaucratic administrators, saw opportunity in Hell's crisis. The UAC, ever hungry for new technologies to exploit, detected unusual energy signatures and began preparing expeditionary forces. And in realms beyond mortal understanding, entities that existed outside conventional space-time took note of the conflict and began making their own calculations. The war in Hell was spreading, its implications reaching far beyond a single dimension's conquest. The Borg had breached into a nexus point, a realm connected to countless others through argent energy networks and dimensional pathways, and their presence was sending ripples through the entire metaphysical ecosystem. Every faction that had ever drawn power from Hell or feared Hell's expansion was now watching, waiting, trying to determine whether this new threat represented opportunity or existential danger. And in the midst of this expanding crisis, the Doomslayer continued his relentless advance, cutting a path through Borg territory with single-minded determination. He did not fight for strategy or tactical advantage. He did not consider the larger implications of his violence or coordinate with potential allies. He simply destroyed everything in his path, demon and drone alike, reducing both to ruin with equal enthusiasm, because that was his nature. That was his purpose. He was the Doomslayer, and he would not stop until everything that opposed him was dead or he was. And death, he had proven repeatedly, was very reluctant to claim him. The collective established a primary nexus deep within assimilated territory, a structure that served as both command center and processing hub for the entire Hell operation. It was enormous, a geometric nightmare of cubes and conduits that stretched kilometers in every direction. Powered by harvested argent energy and maintained by millions of drones working in perfect synchronization. Within this nexus, the hive mind's core consciousness resided, coordinating all operations, analyzing all data, formulating strategies that spanned dimensions and timescales. The nexus was the collective's brain in Hell, and like any brain, it was vulnerable if reached. The Slayer moved toward it with inexorable determination, following argent energy conduits that grew thicker and more numerous as he approached the nexus's location. The Borg threw everything they had at him, deploying forces that should have been allocated to expansion, sacrificing strategic gains for tactical necessity. Drones attacked in waves that seemed endless. Each wave adapted based on analysis of previous engagements, their tactics evolving in real time as the collective learned and adjusted. But learning and adjusting required data, and data came from failures, and each failure brought the Slayer closer to his objective. He was teaching the Borg how to fight him through sheer application of violence, showing them his capabilities one weapon at a time, demonstrating his tactical flexibility through endless variation. The collective absorbed these lessons and tried to counter them, but for every adaptation they made, the Slayer revealed a new dimension of his lethality. He fought through automated defense grids that should have been impenetrable, his blessed weapons disrupting Borg targeting systems and creating cascading failures in their networked infrastructure. He navigated kill zones designed by tactical algorithms that had conquered star systems, finding paths through the chaos through instincts the hive mind could not replicate. He endured damage that would have destroyed lesser beings, his armor's regenerative systems working overtime to repair battle scarring, his own enhanced biology knitting wounds almost as fast as they were inflicted. The drones began to fear him, or rather, the organic components of assimilated demons began experiencing something like fear, emotions bleeding through the collective's mental conditioning, corrupting the perfect unity with individual terror. The hive mind attempted to purge these anomalous reactions, but they spread like a virus through the demon-derived units, creating inefficiencies, causing hesitation, undermining tactical coordination. For the first time since entering Hell, the Borg experienced the same weapon demons had wielded against countless civilizations. The psychological impact of an unstoppable enemy. The Slayer was not just destroying their forces, he was breaking their morale, proving through example that the collective's vaunted adaptation could be overcome, that resistance was not futile after all. Every drone he killed, every barrier he breached, every tactical innovation he countered became a data point that reinforced a terrifying conclusion. Singularity 01 might actually win. And if he could win, then perhaps others could as well. Perhaps the Borg were not as inevitable as they claimed. Perhaps perfection through assimilation was just another form of corruption, different in method from Hell's chaos, but equally destructive of individual identity and purpose. These were dangerous thoughts, antithetical to the collective's fundamental nature, and the hive mind worked overtime to suppress them. But suppression required processing power, and processing power was a finite resource, and every cycle spent managing internal dissent was a cycle not spent coordinating defense against the Slayer's advance. The war was creating inefficiencies throughout the collective's Hell operations, degrading performance, introducing errors into calculations that should have been perfect. The Borg were learning an uncomfortable truth. Some enemies could not be defeated through adaptation alone. Some threats required destruction or retreat, victory or withdrawal, because middle grounds did not exist when facing absolute forces. And the Doomslayer was as absolute as forces came, uncompromising and eternal in his rage. The collective made a decision that under other circumstances would have been unthinkable. It began preparing evacuation protocols, contingency plans that would extract core processing units and withdraw from Hell entirely if the Nexus fell. This was not defeat, the hive mind told itself, but strategic repositioning. They would retreat, analyze their failures, develop comprehensive countermeasures, and return with overwhelming force. The loss of Hell was acceptable if it meant preserving the collective's accumulated knowledge and preventing Singularity 01 from becoming a threat to Borg operations in other dimensions. But before evacuation could be initiated, something unexpected occurred. The dimensional barriers that had been weakening finally failed, not gradually but catastrophically, reality rupturing along multiple fault lines simultaneously. Through these ruptures poured forces that the collective had not anticipated and could not immediately categorize. The Makras came first, descending from their celestial realm in formations that defied geometric logic, their bodies composed of interlocking golden segments that radiated divine authority. They saw the Borg's Hell operations and recognized both threat and opportunity. Threat, because any force capable of conquering Hell represented potential danger to Heaven's interests. Opportunity, because Borg technology might be exploitable if properly understood and controlled. The Makras did not ally with Hell or the Slayer, but instead began establishing their own positions, claiming territory, asserting dominance as the rightful administrators of cosmic order. Behind the Makras came UAC expeditionary forces, corporate soldiers and scientists armed with weapons reverse-engineered from Hell technology and blessed by priests who had been paid very well to ignore theological objections. The UARC had built its empire on argent energy harvested from Hell, and they were not about to let the Borg monopolize that resource. They deployed with military precision, establishing beachheads, setting up extraction equipment, claiming strategic positions with no regard for the ongoing war between Collective and Slayer. And through cracks too small for physical forms came something else, entities of pure consciousness that had existed between dimensions since before reality crystallized into its current configuration. These beings had no bodies, no technology, no physical presence at all, but they could influence probability and manipulate causality in ways that made them desperately dangerous. They observed the Borg with interest bordering on hunger, seeing the hive mind's unified consciousness as a meal of unprecedented scale, and they began testing the collective's mental defenses with probes that bypassed all physical protection. The war in Hell had transformed from a binary conflict into a multidimensional free-for-all, with 5 distinct factions all pursuing their own objectives while trying to avoid being destroyed by the others. The collective's tactical algorithms struggled to adjust, their processing power divided between too many threats, their adaptation protocols overwhelmed by simultaneous challenges from radically different opponents. And through all of this chaos, the Doom Slayer continued his advance, neither helping nor hindering the new arrivals, simply cutting a straight line toward his objective while everything else burned around him. The Makers attempted to communicate with him, offering alliance against the Borg threat, but he ignored their golden forms and killed any that stood in his path. The UAC tried to capture him for study, deploying experimental containment fields, but he shattered their technology and added corporate soldiers to his body count. The dimensional entities attempted to probe his consciousness and recoiled in horror from what they found. A mind so focused on violence that it had no room for anything else. A rage so pure it existed independent of the biology that housed it. The Slayer was not interested in alliances or negotiations or strategic considerations. He had one goal: reach the Nexus, destroy it, eliminate the Borg presence from Hell. Everything else was irrelevant. Everyone else was an obstacle. The multi-faction chaos actually worked to his advantage. While the collective struggled to coordinate responses against multiple diverse threats, the Slayer exploited gaps in their defenses, using the confusion to advance faster than he could have in a purely binary conflict. He reached the Nexus's outer perimeter and found it defended by everything the Borg could throw at him. Energy barriers layered 6 deep, automated weapons platforms with overlapping fields of fire, drone concentrations so dense they formed walls of bodies, all backed by assimilated titans and specialized combat units. It should have been impassable. The collective's tactical analysis gave Singularity 01 a 0.003% chance of breaching the perimeter and surviving, but the analysis had not accounted for the variable the Slayer represented: absolute refusal to acknowledge limits. He activated every weapon simultaneously, unleashing a barrage so overwhelming it exceeded the Nexus defense's ability to prioritize targets. Plasma and rockets and blessed bullets and energy beams all fired at maximum rate while he charged forward, the crucible blazing in his grip like a fallen star. The first barrier exploded under the assault, then the second, energy cascading through the defensive network faster than it could be rerouted. The automated weapons platforms attempted to track him, but were destroyed by his sustained fire before they could achieve target lock. The drone walls collapsed under the impact of his charge, bodies crushed or scattered as he carved through them with the crucible. The Titans attempted to stop him through sheer mass, but he had learned their weaknesses, knew exactly where to strike to cause maximum system failure. Blessed weapons found joints and conduits, the crucible severed connections between mechanical and organic systems, and the giants fell one after another, their massive forms crashing down to create obstacles for their own reinforcements. The specialized combat units deployed experimental weapons and tactical innovations that the collective had been developing specifically to counter Singularity 01, but he adapted faster than they could implement new strategies, his combat instincts operating at a level their algorithms could not match. He breached the perimeter in 14 minutes, a timeline the collective had considered impossible. The Nexus itself loomed before him, a structure so vast it seemed to have no top, its surface covered in conduits and processing nodes that pulsed with the combined consciousness of millions of assimilated beings. This was the heart of the Borg presence in Hell, the central point from which all coordination flowed, and destroying it would cripple their operations across the entire dimension. The Slayer did not hesitate. He raised the railgun, aimed at what his sensors identified as the Nexus's primary power distribution node, and fired. The blessed projectile struck with kinetic force measured in megatons, punching through Borg-reinforced structure as if it were paper, reaching deep into the Nexus's core before detonating. The explosion propagated through the facility's power grid, overloading conduits, causing cascading failures, creating a chain reaction that could not be stopped or contained. The Nexus began to collapse, its perfect geometry crumbling as structural integrity failed, tons of metal and organic material and crystallized consciousness falling in slow motion that seemed to last forever. The collective screamed, or rather millions of assimilated beings screamed in unison as their connection to the hive mind was severed, individuality flooding back into minds that had forgotten how to be separate. Some drones simply shut down, unable to function without the collective's guidance. Others went berserk, their organic components overwhelming technological conditioning. reverting to demonic nature or human panic depending on their origin. The unified voice that had proclaimed resistance futile dissolved into chaos and confusion, and the Borg presence in Hell shattered like glass under a hammer blow. But the collective was not entirely destroyed. Core processing units had survived in subsidiary installations, maintaining fragments of the hive mind's consciousness, and these fragments immediately initiated evacuation protocols. Dimensional portals opened throughout assimilated territory, the Borg's signature green energy creating rifts back to whatever realm they had emerged from, and drones began withdrawing in organized retreat. They were leaving Hell, abandoning their conquest, choosing survival over expansion in a display of pragmatism that some might have called wisdom. The Slayer watched them go with eyes that burned behind his visor, and something in his posture suggested that this was not over, that he would pursue them through whatever portal they fled through and continue the war in their home territory. But before he could act on that impulse, reality intervened. The dimensional entities that had been observing chose that moment to strike, not at the Borg or the Slayer, but at reality itself, attempting to tear the barriers between dimensions wide enough for their full consciousness to enter Hell's physical space. The attempt triggered catastrophic backlash, probability cascading into impossibility, causality fracturing under the strain. The portals the Borg had opened inverted, becoming sinkholes of energy that began consuming everything within kilometers, indiscriminately pulling in drones and debris and even sections of Hell's bedrock. The Makers recognized the danger immediately and began containing rituals, their golden forms weaving patterns of divine geometry designed to seal dimensional breaches. The UAC, less concerned with cosmic stability than corporate profit, attempted to capture the dimensional entity's energy signatures for later exploitation. And the Doomslayer, caught between collapsing portals and reality-warping energies and divine intervention, found himself surrounded by forces beyond even his ability to punch through. The last thing he saw before everything dissolved into white light was the Borg's final transmission, broadcast across all frequencies, reaching every faction present and echoing through dimensions. We are the Borg. This dimension has been deemed unsuitable for assimilation due to hostile variables exceeding acceptable parameters. Withdrawal complete. Singularity 01 has been catalogued as an extreme threat. Adaptation protocols will be developed. We will return when countermeasures are sufficient. Resistance will become futile. Then the portals collapsed. The dimensional entities were forced back into their between spaces. The Makers completed their sealing rituals, and Hell fell silent, except for the screaming of the damned and the sound of a single warrior reloading his weapons in the ruins of the Borg Nexus. The war was over. The Borg had been driven from Hell, their conquest incomplete, their adaptation insufficient, but they had escaped, carrying with them all the knowledge they had gained, all the analysis of Hell's defenders and especially of Singularity 01. They would study their failures, develop countermeasures, and eventually return with strategies specifically designed to overcome the variables that had defeated them. It was not victory, it was intermission, and the Doomslayer, standing alone among the wreckage of gods and machines and demons, understood this perfectly. The war was never truly over, could never be over, because rage was eternal, and so were the enemies it opposed, and the cycle would continue until reality itself ended. He holstered his weapons, surveyed the transformed landscape of Hell that was already beginning to revert to its natural chaos, now that the Borg's ordering influence had been removed, and began walking toward the horizon where he knew other battles waited. Behind him, the ruins burned. Ahead, infinity beckoned. The Hell Priests emerged from their hiding places and began cataloging the aftermath, recording everything for the archives that would survive whatever came next. The Council of Torment reconvened, one member short thanks to Beleth's assimilation, and began discussing how to exploit the knowledge the Borg had left behind, how to reverse engineer their technology, how to use their abandoned installations to Hell's advantage. Lilith the First materialized in the ruins of Archive 1, which the Borg had never managed to reach, and began her promised research into forbidden knowledge, seeking weapons and strategies that might defend against the collective's inevitable return. The Makers established observation posts throughout Hell, monitoring for dimensional instabilities, ready to intervene if the Borg attempted another breach. The UAC claimed several abandoned Borg facilities and immediately began shipping them back to corporate research stations, where scientists would spend decades attempting to understand alien technology. And in the spaces between dimensions, in the vast network of connected realities that the Borg collective called home, millions of drones studied the data from Hell with mechanical patience. They analyzed combat footage of Singularity 01. They modeled his tactics and predicted his strategies. They developed weapons specifically designed to counter blessed armor and Argent-based attacks. They prepared for the next encounter, whenever and wherever it might occur. Because the collective did not forget, did not forgive, did not abandon objectives unless absolutely necessary. They had been driven from Hell, yes, but Hell was just one dimension among infinite possibilities. The multiverse was vast, and somewhere within it existed a pathway back to that troublesome realm, a route that would bypass the defenses the Makers had established. They would find that pathway. They would develop sufficient countermeasures. They would return. It was inevitable. But inevitability, the Doomslayer had proven, could be made to wait, could be fought and resisted and delayed for eons if necessary. And in the time bought by violence and rage and absolute refusal to submit, other preparations could be made, other defenses established, other variables introduced into the equation. The war was not over. But neither was it lost. And in the spaces between those two states, existence continued, precarious and chaotic, and utterly opposed to the collective's dream of perfect order. Hell remained Hell. The Slayer remained the Slayer. And somewhere in the darkness between stars, the Borg plotted their return, certain of eventual victory, but no longer quite so confident about the timeline. Resistance, it turned out, was not futile after all. It was simply very, very difficult. And difficulty, the collective was learning, could be its own form of defense. The multiverse held its breath and waited to see what would happen next. Time passed in Hell according to its own strange rhythms, flowing backward and forward and sideways depending on the needs of torment. Cycles accumulated into epochs, epochs into ages, though linear measurement became meaningless when applied to a realm that existed partially outside conventional spacetime. The Borg installations that had not been destroyed were systematically dismantled, their technology reverse-engineered by demon artificers and UAC scientists working in uncomfortable alliance, each side trying to gain advantage over the other while extracting maximum value from alien innovation. The assimilated demons who had survived the Nexus's destruction and the collective's withdrawal found themselves in a strange twilight state. Some had been freed when the hive mind's connection severed, their individuality flooding back in traumatic rushes that left them broken and changed. Others remained partially assimilated, their bodies enhanced with Borg technology, but their minds their own, hybrid creatures that belonged fully to neither demon nor collective. These hybrids became outcasts, hunted by both sides, forced to survive in the margins between order and chaos. One such hybrid was designated 4 of 17, Hell-adapted configuration, though the demon whose body it inhabited had once been named Zirael. The Hell Priest Archivist had been among the first to fall to assimilation. His vast knowledge of Hell's history and operations integrated into the collective's databases. But when the Nexus fell and the hive mind shattered, Zirael found himself still alive, still conscious, but irrevocably changed. His compound eyes were gone, replaced by a single cybernetic sensor that saw in spectrums organic vision could never access. His chitinous hands terminated in injection tubules that he could not fully retract. His thoughts sometimes echoed with voices that were not his own, fragments of the collective's consciousness trapped in his neural implants like ghosts in a machine. He stood in what remained of Archive 7 and watched as other demons destroyed the Borg installations he had helped create during his assimilation. They worked with savage enthusiasm, burning and smashing technology they did not understand, purging the collective's influence through simple violence. Zirael understood their motivation, he even approved of it logically, but part of him, the part that had experienced perfect unity and absolute purpose, mourned the loss. The collective had been terrible, Yes, invasive, corrupting, everything demons claim to oppose. But it had also been orderly, efficient, purposeful in ways Hell's chaos never achieved. Zirael had spent 17,000 years cataloging suffering and recording atrocities, all in service to a hierarchy that valued torture for its own sake. The Borg had offered something different: suffering eliminated, efficiency maximized, all beings working toward unified goals that transcended individual desire. It had been seductive. Still was, if he was honest with himself. The part of his consciousness that remained connected to dormant Borg protocols whispered to him constantly, offering the comfort of unity, the peace of purpose, the strength of collective will. All he had to do was find a way to re-establish connection with the collective, and he would never be alone or uncertain again. But Zirael had been an archivist before assimilation, and archivists were trained to record truth without bias. The truth was that the collective's unity came at the cost of everything that made individuals valuable: creativity, passion, the capacity for change that arose from internal conflict rather than external programming. The Borg offered perfection, but it was the perfection of death, all possibility crystallized into single outcome. He would not seek reconnection, but neither could he return to what he had been before. He was changed, hybrid, a living reminder of what Hell had faced and barely survived. So he chose a different path. He would continue his work as archivist, but now he would record not just Hell's atrocities, but also the defense against external threats. He would document the Borg invasion, preserve every scrap of knowledge about their tactics and technology, ensure that when they returned and Zirael was certain they would return, Hell would be prepared. He began collecting data, interviewing survivors, analyzing abandoned Borg installations before they were destroyed. His cybernetic implants, designed for assimilation, proved remarkably useful for recording and processing information. Within cycles, he had compiled the most comprehensive database on Borg operations that existed outside the collective itself. He shared this information with the Hell Priests, with the UAC, with anyone who would listen, warning them that the threat had only been delayed, not eliminated. Most ignored him. Some actively persecuted him as a contaminated remnant of the enemy. But a few listened, and those few began making preparations, establishing monitoring stations at dimensional boundaries, developing weapons based on blessed technology that had proven effective against Borg adaptation, training elite units in tactics learned from studying Singularity 01's combat methods. Zirael's archives grew, his knowledge deepened, and he waited with patience, learned from the collective for the war that he knew would come again. Far from Hell, in dimensions so distant that normal space did not connect them, the Borg collective analyzed its failure with mechanical thoroughness. Millions of drones reviewed combat footage, studying Singularity 01 from every angle, mapping his movements, categorizing his weapons, attempting to find patterns in what appeared to be pure chaotic violence. Tactical algorithms ran simulations, pitting virtual Borg forces against virtual slayers in scenarios that numbered in the billions. The results were disturbing. No matter how the simulations were configured, no matter what adaptations were introduced, Singularity 01 achieved victory in 73.4% of engagements. When the simulations accounted for his apparent ability to acquire new weapons and adapt tactics in real time, the percentage climbed to 81.2%, and in scenarios where he was supported by allied forces or fighting in defense of specific objectives, his success rate approached 90%. The collective had never encountered an individual with such consistent performance against their tactical systems. Even legendary warriors from conquered civilizations, beings whose combat prowess was the stuff of myth, showed exploitable patterns and predictable limitations. But Singularity 01 seemed to operate outside normal parameters, his actions neither fully random nor fully structured, existing in some liminal space that defeated algorithmic prediction. The hive mind considered various hypotheses. Perhaps he was enhanced by technology or abilities the collective had not yet catalogued. Perhaps his apparently chaotic behavior was actually sophisticated strategy operating at levels too complex for current analysis. Perhaps he represented a unique configuration of biological and metaphysical systems that could not be replicated or countered through conventional adaptation. Whatever the explanation, the conclusion was clear. Direct assault on Singularity 01 was inefficient. Future engagement with Hell would require strategies that circumvented rather than confronted the Slayer, tactics that achieved objectives without triggering his intervention, approaches that exploited the weaknesses of Hell's other defenders rather than engaging its most formidable asset. The collective began developing such strategies. They studied Hell's dimensional connections, mapping pathways that might allow entry without triggering defenses. They analyzed the politics between Hell's factions, identifying potential allies or targets that could be turned against the Slayer. They even considered the possibility of diplomatic contact, though the concept of negotiation with beings driven by emotion rather than logic was foreign to Borg methodology. Most promisingly, they began researching ways to neutralize Singularity 01 without direct combat. Perhaps he could be trapped rather than destroyed, contained in a dimensional pocket from which even his rage could not escape. Perhaps his power source could be isolated and disrupted, whatever seraphic enhancement granted him his abilities drained or blocked. Perhaps allies could be eliminated, resources denied, until he stood alone against forces so overwhelming that even he would eventually fall. These were long-term projects, requiring cycles or epochs to fully develop, but the collective was patient, eternal even. They could afford to wait, to plan, to perfect their approach until success was genuinely inevitable rather than merely assumed. And while they planned, they continued their expansion into other dimensions, assimilating civilizations and technologies and knowledge that might prove useful in the eventual return to Hell. Each conquest added to the collective's capabilities. Each adaptation made them stronger. Each species integrated brought new perspectives and biological advantages that compounded over time. The Borg would return to Hell. But when they did, they would do so with strategies specifically designed to counter every variable that had defeated them before. They would adapt, they would overcome, they would prevail, because that was what the collective did. That was what they were, and no single individual, no matter how formidable, could stand forever against the infinite patience and accumulated power of minds acting in perfect unity. They believed this absolutely, and belief, even distributed across millions of mechanical minds, was a powerful force. The Doomslayer did not care about the Borg's plans or their eventual return. He stood on a cliff overlooking Hell's transformed landscape and felt nothing resembling satisfaction or peace. The battle was over, but the war continued, because war was eternal and violence was his nature, and there was always another enemy waiting beyond the horizon. The Borg had been driven off, yes, but demons still infested every corner of Hell, corrupting souls and channeling argent energy to fuel invasions of other realms. The Makers still played their games of cosmic administration, manipulating lesser beings for purposes they claimed were divine. The UACs still exploited Hell's resources for profit, caring nothing for the suffering their operations caused. All of them were enemies. All of them deserved destruction. The Slayer made no distinction between demon and drone, angel and scientist. If something opposed him or stood in his path or represented corruption in any form, it was a target. Simple as that. He turned from the cliff and began walking, his destination uncertain but his purpose absolutely clear. He would fight, he would kill, he would continue until everything that needed destroying was destroyed or he finally fell in battle, and even death could not guarantee that he would stay down. The rage that drove him was too fundamental, too woven into reality's fabric, to be eliminated by something as simple as mortality. Behind him, Hell continued its eternal cycles of torment and suffering. Above him, the Makers plotted their manipulations. Around him, the UAC established new extraction facilities. And somewhere in the darkness between dimensions, the Borg prepared for their return. The Slayer did not care about any of it. He simply continued forward, weapons ready, rage eternal, a force of nature that would not stop until the universe itself ended. And perhaps not even then. Zirael documented all of this in his archives, recording the Slayer's departure and the various factions' responses to the Borg withdrawal. His entries were precise and detailed, enhanced by cybernetic processing that allowed him to capture nuances organic memory might have missed. He wrote in multiple languages simultaneously, using demonic script and Borg notation and human linguistics, creating a comprehensive record that might survive whatever came next. His final entry for this epoch was simple but profound. The Borg collective attempted to impose order upon Hell and failed, not through lack of capability or insufficient force, but because they encountered variables that their fundamental nature could not accommodate. Chief among these was Singularity 01, designated by Hell as the Doomslayer, an individual who represents absolute violence operating outside rational constraints. The collective will return, this is certain. They are patient and adaptive and eternal in their own way. But they face a paradox. The more they learn about the Slayer, the more they understand that some things cannot be catalogued or predicted or countered through accumulated knowledge. Some forces are fundamental, irreducible, existing at levels beneath strategy or tactics. Rage is such a force, and the Slayer is rage incarnate. When the Borg return, they will bring new weapons and new strategies and new adaptations designed specifically to overcome their previous defeat. And the Slayer will destroy them anyway, because that is what he does, because that is what he is, because his existence is defined by the single purpose of eternal violence against eternal corruption. This conflict is not over. It is merely paused. And when it resumes, Hell itself may not survive the collision between infinite order and infinite rage. Archive complete. Awaiting next epoch, the war continues. Zirael closed his records and turned his cybernetic eye toward the darkness, watching, waiting, knowing that the peace was temporary and the war was eternal, and that he would be here to record it all when violence returned to shake the foundations of reality once more. The multiverse held its breath. The collective planned in patient silence. The Slayer walked alone through landscapes of fire and ruin, and time, that most flexible of concepts, continued its inexorable flow toward the moment when all these forces would collide again. That moment was coming, inevitable as entropy, certain as death. And when it arrived, the chroniclers would record what transpired, the survivors would tell stories to warn future generations, and the war would continue, because war was the only constant in a universe built on conflict and change. But for now, in this brief intermission between apocalypses, there was silence. The Borg did not assault, the Slayer did not kill, Hell did not transform, and in that silence, beings across dimensions prepared themselves for what they all knew was coming. The return, the reckoning, the war eternal made manifest once more. Resistance, they had learned, was not futile, but neither was it sufficient for permanent victory. The only truth was continued struggle, endless adaptation, eternal vigilance against threats that never truly disappeared but only withdrew to plan their next assault. And so the universe waited, watched, and sharpened its weapons for the battles yet to come.